Table talk. We had my friend, Rabbi, my friend Elias Saratowski, the regional director of APAC. And this is a new program we're going to be doing once a month. It's an opportunity to have people in the Jewish and non-Jewish community throughout the city. Next month on September 4th, we'll be having my friend Ken Brown Marshall from Channel 2, and the head interviewer of Newsmakers, which is a wonderful show that gives us an opportunity to learn about what's happening in the greater Houston area. Tonight, I have an opportunity to sit down with Rabbi Kenny Weiss, who's the rabbi and executive director for Houston Hillel. Rabbi Weiss is also a lecturer in religious studies at the University of Houston. Prior to arriving in Houston Hillel in 2001, Kenny served as the congregational rabbi in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C. He earned a degree in communication from the University of California at San Diego, a secondary social studies teaching credential from the University of Colorado in Boulder, along with a master's degree in Hebrew letters and rabbinical ordination from Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in New York. Kenny does a lot of local and national stuff to benefit Jewish life for college students and Jewish 20-somethings, but he'd rather tell you that he's married to Rabbi Amy Weiss, founder and executive director of Undies for Everyone. Amy and Kenny enjoy spending time with their sons, Eli and Joshua, and when he's not hanging out with college students, you can find Kenny running around Rice in preparation for the Houston Half Marathon, biking around Houston, figuring out a bouldering problem at the local rock climbing gym, or listening to the Grateful Dead while building something in his garage. So Kenny, I know how much you've been doing for the college students in our community for 20 years. You and I came to Houston the same year.
Yeah, I remember that.
And we've been blessed to call Houston home and raise our children in this extraordinary community ever since. So let's start with the obvious question is, I know my son's returned to college today. He drove back to Austin, so we feel like the last 6 months have been bonus time. That I have the opportunity to be with him, but he's back in Austin this evening, and we hope he's able to stay there till December. But how is campus life going to look like in this pandemic era here in Houston?
Here in Houston, it's kind of like the rest of the country. There are things, there's a whole spectrum of things that are going on. You know, you take a look at the University of Houston, which technically is open, but 85% of those students are taking classes only online. And then if you look at the other 15% of the students, it doesn't mean they're all in person. It means that they have just at least one class in person, or maybe it's a class that's high flex, which means that it's half online and half in person. And at Rice, they are testing their students, every week for COVID. And they probably have about half of their dorm spaces full. But there are lots of people who are choosing to learn remotely. I was on a Zoom call today with a student at Rice who's a freshman and has chosen to stay in Colorado rather than come here to campus. It's a difficult situation for some people. I was talking to a student from Ohio last week who still hadn't decided if this person was going to be in person here on campus, learn remotely, or simply take a gap year.
Yeah, it's got to be tough, as it is for all of us, but you feel bad for these college kids who've worked so hard to go to a fine university like Rice or University of Houston or another college here, and then they're not able to have the full experience like so many of us got to enjoy.
So yeah, you're absolutely right. And for so much of college, if you've been reading, the articles that have been around in the last few months about, what is college about? And, we kind of had a stereotype that college is about living in the dorms and being part of that social life. Of course, that is not at all representative of students throughout the country who attend college. But I think it's what our community tends to think of. It's the stereotype that we have. And you're absolutely right. For those people who are looking forward to it, it can be an incredible disappointment.
So, God willing, life will return to normal at some point, probably in the next year. Let's pray. And let's assume it does. What's campus life like for a Jewish college student in Houston during normal times?
So during normal times, gosh, I've been working with my staff trying to go with the attitude that what is happening now is actually normal in terms of putting ourselves into it to make life for students this semester as enriching as possible. But really what's going on is the same thing I would assume in your work. It's really all about relationships. Yeah. It's about connecting with people, and it's sometimes not necessarily about doing something Jewish. It's about connecting with them, learning about their lives, learning about their hopes, their dreams, their concerns, any number of things like that. And that's really what we do. We talk about being in the relationship business, and the kind of relationships that we form are within a Jewish context.
And I'm sure our students, Jewish college students here, appreciate having a rabbi like yourself and your staff. I know what the Hillel staff did for me, and I wouldn't be a rabbi today if it wasn't for that staff at the University of Texas. So I know what a profound effect someone like yourself and other Hillel staff members can have for these college students, some of which come from all over the world.
And I hope you've called that Hillel director recently to tell them.
Oh, many times. Many times. I've done sermons about it.
Okay, that's great, because we're kind of like teachers.
Yeah.
You have an impact, and you might not know, or you're fortunate enough to have somebody call you up 25 years later.
Absolutely. No, luckily it's just a few hours away, and I'm still in touch with some of the people that were at Hillel when I was a student, and now having my son there, and he's going to Hillel, so it's really nice. So I have to ask, speaking of our college days, in your estimation, how are college students different today from when we were in college?
So you're slightly younger than me, but I think what you have is a separation that really is about baby boomers to everybody who came after, and I think baby boomers technically end in like 1964. So if you were born prior to 1964, you went to college with a typewriter, not with a computer. I mean, I remember I graduated from college in '83. I was using a typewriter. By the time I entered Boulder for my teacher credential a few years later, I was using a computer. Didn't have one, had to go to the lab in the library.
I remember
but that was the transition, and I think that transition has to do also with social media. So it's kind of a generational thing. When we went to college, or I say when I went to college, I had, wonderful achievements that not too many people knew about. And I had failures and embarrassing things that, thank goodness, not too many people knew about.
Yeah.
But today, both those achievements and those failures and those embarrassing moments, everybody knows about all of a sudden, and it doesn't disappear. There was a wonderful editorial in the New York Times, I think, a couple of years ago, written by a higher ed administrator who was reflecting on his own life and made the observation that before the internet, essentially, before social media, if you did something embarrassing, even if you did something that got you a night in jail, nobody knew. You went home, and as this person said in his editorial, you learned a valuable lesson.
Yeah.
And that privilege, that opportunity to learn doesn't exist in the same way today. And so I think that's one of the differences. I'll tell you what's not different. What's not different are the emotions that college students feel. If you really think back to how you felt, when you wanted to ask someone out on a date maybe in college, or when you were unsure about a test, those kind of emotions, or when you wanted to try something new and different that you didn't want to tell your parents about, right? Because you just didn't. It wasn't, you didn't want to share that. Those emotions, that kind of experimentation, that kind of wondering, that totally happens today in exactly the same way.
That's good to know. It's funny, I remember a small thing. I remember when we would have our grades posted by our teachers, it would be done by our Social Security number.
On the bulletin board, right? Oh my God.
Yeah, and now my son asked me the other day, Dad, what's my Social Security number? He has no idea, he's never used it. The little things like that, it would never be shown today because of identity theft, because of the internet.
Exactly.
And
that's
it's interesting, you don't think about those things until you have a child that's there, or you obviously see it all the time. Let's talk specifically about your Hillel. What are the strengths of your Hillel, and what are your unique challenges?
So really the unique challenge that we have, which makes us fairly unique in the Hillel world, is that we work with so many different constituencies. Most people think of Houston Hillel and they think Rice, University of Houston, but we have undergraduates at another half dozen universities. In fact, earlier today, just a few hours ago, I was on a Zoom call with the student leaders of Hillel at Stephen F. Austin University, 2.5 hours north of us, which is in Houston Hillel's orbit. We support them financially, we support them in all the same ways that we support students at Rice and at UH.
Good.
We have students at Blinn College, Lamar College, HCC, A&M Galveston. All of these places have students. There's one student this year who's at Houston Baptist University. And students end up at these places because there's a specific program they want or something like that. So that's one of the challenges. But the other thing that people really don't realize is that half of our work, fully half of our work, is with 20-somethings, and about a third of them are graduate students. And of those graduate students, they're on 7 different campuses. And they're all independent. They don't necessarily interact with each other. So you could say that we're really operating more than a dozen separate Hillel foundations under one roof.
That's certainly great opportunities, but a great challenge, I'm sure.
And the challenge extends to the pandemic and the situation we find ourselves in today. You probably heard at UT about whatever their protocols are, and you heard from Hillel at UT that this is their protocol. We can't do that. We might have no in-person programs for University of Houston, but we will have for Rice because they're on campus. And then we might have grad students who are all virtual, or they might be some in person. And then we have young professionals, some of whom are incredibly cautious, and others of whom can't wait to go to a bar on Saturday night. So we're kind of all over the place with that kind of stuff, and that's a challenge too.
So one question that I'm sure you get a lot is about the challenges our Jewish students have when it comes to Israel. You may have seen, I'm sure you did, an open resignation letter. University of Southern California's student government head, Rose Rich, resigned last week because she believed her Jewish and Zionist identities made her a target of harassment, slander, and bullying. And my colleague, Rabbi David Wolpe, recently sent out a tweet that said, being a Zionist is the one impermissible identity for college students. So I have to ask, what's it like? What's the latest on BDS on campuses here in Houston?
So there's really 2 answers to your question. One answer is, how does that really impact students?
Sure.
And the other answer is that it might not impact students at all, which doesn't lessen or negate the kind of things that you're talking about, especially the situation at USC, which is just horrendous, not only from a student standpoint in terms of student government and student body, but also in terms of the administration at USC, which really did not step up in any meaningful way. So, here we have students who, so it really gets back to the relationships. I frequently hear from people who are very strong on Israel that, you got to connect the students with Israel, right? Sometimes I just want to connect them with Judaism. Israel is another step, and it's not something that sometimes you can just introduce right away. So for some of our students, Israel, and especially anti-Israel activity, is incredibly burdensome. At the University of Houston, hasn't been this way for a few years, thankfully, but a few years ago we had a time when people really didn't want to interact with Hillel because the anti-Israel stuff was so heavy.
Wow.
And challenges came also with interacting with administration, who, and you can't really blame them, but who would see things and they'd appreciate the anti-Israel activity and they'd appreciate how it impacted students, but they saw it siloed. Whereas for our students, it wasn't siloed, it was an accumulation of events that just became more and more of a burden. That situation isn't really going on right now in the same way, although perhaps you've also been reading about increase in online anti-Semitic activity and anti-Israel activity. And we haven't yet seen that, but classes don't start for another week and a half.
No, that's right. Well, what are some of the things, I know you have a great birthright trip You go to,
So we do amazing things. One of the most amazing things, in fact, the probably #1 thing that we do is we have what's called an Israel Fellow. Many Hillels have, and this is an Israeli who works for a Hillel, and we just finished with one person for 3 years. We have a new person, Lior, who's supposed to arrive just in a few weeks.
Great.
And her purpose, just as our shlichim that work for the community, what we find is that if you just interact with an Israeli, you feel better about Israel.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be that you talk about Israel. It's just interacting with the Israeli. And so much of what we do also isn't just with Jewish students, it's with non-Jewish students. About 15% of our participants at Houston Hillel last year were not Jewish.
Huh.
And some of this, a lot of it comes from the incredible amount of interfaith work that we do, because we know that if we just reach out to Jewish students, especially with regard to Israel, that's not going to be enough. That's not enough for Israel. It's not enough for our community. One of the things that we've really been privileged to do the past year, and unfortunately we had a trip like this canceled just a couple months ago, but we now take trips primarily of non-Jewish student leaders to Israel and the territories. And they talk with people on both sides, and they get an incredible perspective on the conflict. And we come back, and our goal isn't necessarily to have a bunch of non-Jewish students who are gung-ho pro-Israel. That's just unrealistic.
Right.
But what we do want is we want people to appreciate that the conflict is nuanced, that it can be complicated. Sometimes it's not, but it can be complicated.
Sure.
And that when somebody says something intersectional, for example, where they conflate pro-Palestinian with Black Lives Matter, different things like this, that you don't have people who say, yeah, that sounds good, I agree with that, but rather think more critically about it and ask intelligent questions. And that's exactly what we've had. And these trips have been amazing. They have included student body presidents from Weiss and student senators from the University of Houston, people like that.
That's good to hear, and that's what we want from our college students, right? These are young people that are learning about life and making decisions, and we'd want them to be informed.
That's right.
And make their own intelligent decisions.
Yeah.
And that's good to hear. What can we at Beth Yeshurun, our members, do to help?
You mean besides donating?
Besides donating, which absolutely, and I know it's going to be important for all of us.
I wouldn't be a responsible nonprofit executive, right?
That's okay. We understand.
Actually, there's some wonderful things to be done. Mostly, it's helping us identify people. In all of my time at Houston Hillel, I think I've only gotten a handful of emails from synagogues, from families saying, hey, so-and-so is going to be a freshman on campus. And it's a challenge for a lot of synagogues because, the people who continue with their Jewish education through high school kind of self-select, and we know who they are, they find us.
Right.
It's finding those people who kind of checked out after bar bat mitzvah age.
Right.
But to identify them, and then we can kind of take it from there.
Makes sense.
That's a lot of it. Some of the things that the community can do also is to, I think, be balanced. Our conversation just a couple minutes ago about how college is a time for learning, exploration, for helping people make their own decisions. It is not a time for indoctrination. It's not a time for telling people what is right, what is wrong, but it's about presenting a balanced perspective.
All right, so one last question. We have students watching tonight, parents and grandparents of students that are going off to campus. What advice would you give any Jewish student going to campus this fall?
So for a Jewish student, it's to give Hillel your contact information. You don't have to go. You don't have to respond. In fact, one of the things that I tell people is that going to UC San Diego, I didn't do anything with Hillel. Ended up a rabbi,
And a Hillel rabbi, yeah.
I took Jewish studies classes.
Sure.
I took Hebrew. I did lots of Jewish stuff, but it wasn't with Hillel. And so the point is that I don't really worry so much about how students are involved, but I am really concerned that they're connected with Hillel for a couple reasons. One is, if you don't know what's going on, you can't say yes or no.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that there are incredible opportunities, and we've seen some of those opportunities. I've seen them just in the past few months. You know, the pandemic isn't just a pandemic, it's an economic crisis. And I've had Jewish students at many different universities send me texts and emails like, Kenny, do you know of any student scholarships? Yeah. And I do. I know of loads of scholarships specifically for Jewish students, and I have resources like that. And there are things like that. And God forbid you have a tragedy in your family. Yeah. You know, if something personal happens, it's nice to have someone that you can turn to. So it's about the contact information.
Well, especially right now, because for our students that go out of state, it would be hard for parents to fly there to get there. They may not see their families for 4 months now.
That's right.
And so it's nice to know there's a rabbi there and a Hillel, a synagogue on campus where they can go to, and good times and bad times.
Yeah.
That's an important reminder. Well, we are very fortunate here in Houston to have Rabbi Weiss and his wife, Amy, and all the contributions you guys make to our community. We're very appreciative, and we're always here to support. We have many people who love Hillel in this congregation, so know you can always count on Beth Yeshurun. I hope you enjoyed our table talk this evening. We have this wonderful question sheet that you can go to our website now, download it, and ask these questions at Shabbat dinner tonight about our discussion, and other questions you can ask about what college campus life is like right now for you and your students, your grandchildren, and so you can continue this discussion tonight over your Shabbat dinner. So again, thank you for joining us, and thank you, Rabbi Weiss. We hope to see you again, and best of luck during this unusual fall semester.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Shabbat shalom, everyone.